Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for your patience as we get ready. We're getting ready for this 7th meeting of our project advisory group for the Clark County Housing Option Study and Action Plan. As you may notice, we have interpreters with us this afternoon, American Sign Language interpreters. Thanks to them for helping us out and making our meeting accessible to more people. If anyone is having problems viewing our interpreter, please let us know, maybe through the chat function or however is easiest to you, and we'll see what we can do to resolve that situation. There is an icon at the bottom of your screens that says interpretation. If you are having problems, you might want to click on that icon and choose either English or American Sign Language, whichever is your preference, and that might fix any problems that you're having. As with our last 2 meetings in June and July, we are using a format that allows breakout groups, because we will be having breakout groups a little later in our agenda, which I'll review in just a moment. If those who are not members of the project advisory group could go ahead and go on mute and turn off your cameras, except those folks who need to communicate with via sign language, that would be great, just so we don't have as many screens, videos all at the same time. With that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. Oops. There we go. Jackie, do I get a thumbs up? Can you see my screen? Great. Okay. So our agenda today. Well, again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this important topic, and for our project advisory group members who have been with us throughout the process. This is the 3rd of 3 meetings that the PAG has used to go through a series of potential housing strategies. We went through groups of strategies in June and July, and here we are in August with our 3rd batch of strategies. So what we are going to do today is I will introduce strategies for these final 3 categories, which are process improvements, a category of what we've deemed other strategies that didn't quite fit neatly into some of the previous categories, and displacement strategies. Following the presentation of those strategies, we will break into 2 groups and have a thorough discussion of each of those strategies, as we've done at the past 2 months, and then come back together to report on those discussions. And finally, we will have time for our viewers, our non-PAG members, to share public comments after those group discussions, and then we'll wrap up with next steps. We don't have, Jackie, we don't have any announcements for today, correct?
Hi, Steve. That's correct. I did just want to announce one tiny one, just to announce that we have a new staff member in our department and community planning that's going to be assisting with this project. So I just wanted to introduce Susan Ellinger. She'll be in Steve's breakout session. She comes to us from our sister department, community development. So she's well-versed in county code and county processes, and should be able to bring a lot of her wealth of experience to this project with that. So just wanted to introduce her to the group.
Great, thanks, Susan. All right, so let's dive into our 3rd round of housing action plan strategies. I guess first we want to just talk, I apologize, about our schedule for the coming months. So as I mentioned, June, July, and August, we've gone through, we've had 3, this is the 3rd PAG meeting to go through strategies by category and type. In September, there is no PAG meeting. We are going to bring some of the work that we've been doing to County Council and County Planning Commission and the Development and Engineering Advisory Board. Is that right? Did I get that right, Jackie? Jenna? Yeah. So we're going to bring that information to those folks. Then throughout the rest of September and into early October, we're going to take all of the comments we've received from the PAG and the public over the past few months and start prioritizing the strategies that we've discussed. We will bring those prioritized strategies back to the PAG at their late October, I can't remember the exact date. We'll have that at the end of the presentation for a meeting in October, discuss those priorities, and then use the comments to begin crafting recommendations. We'll be bringing those to the Planning Commission, County Council, and another round of community engagement. We'll have more on that in September. And then eventually refine it. We'll have one more PAG meeting in either November or December. That'll be the final PAG meeting, and then we'll take those to approve those recommendations, and then we'll take those and begin preparing the final action plan, do another round of public engagement, and bring it to the legislative process for adoption. So following today's meeting, we'll have another PAG meeting in October, and then another one either in November or December, depending on how holidays fall and the timing of things. But we'll have, essentially after today, there's 2 more PAG meetings before we package up your recommendations and bring them to through the legislative process for adoption. Okay. The first of 3 categories that we're going to talk about today is process improvements. And if everyone could bear with me for just a moment, we have another member or 2 who needs help logging in. Apologize. Okay. Okay. So the first strategy type that we have here is permitting process streamlining. Providing an efficient, predictable, and user-friendly permitting process can reduce confusion or perception of risk among developers and can lower administrative carrying costs. So we have a number of proposed strategies here. The first is permit the majority of residential uses through a type 1 review rather than a type 2 review and approval. Clarify the standards and procedures for the uses that are subject to review and approval under the county code. So essentially making more residential uses a staff level decision as opposed to planning commission or other review types. Strategy C 1.2, develop pre-approved model plans for new middle housing types, including ADU designs that can be built with type 1 approvals. The one factor here is that the county would need to figure out how to fund the creation of those building plans, but essentially developing templates that people could use and know that they would meet the approval of the county. Next page. Category C 1.3, streamline land use, engineering, and building permit reviews. We don't have any specific recommendations here, but some of the options could include revising the expedited permitting process for targeted or preferred residential projects that meet certain criteria that the county is trying to meet. Another option is supporting the initiative for electronic plan review, again, streamlining and making things easier. The third is review the land use and engineering standards to identify opportunities to promote efficiency in the review/application process and to promote high quality development. In other words, if a project meets certain requirements, then for instance, the landscaping standards could be reduced. So some ideas of what those streamlining options could look like in terms of engineering, land use, and building permit reviews. The next category we have is environmental review, enacting measures or utilizing tools designed to streamline environmental review. Just a second here. So the first, using sub-area planning as a tool to ensure new areas of development are built with neighborhood amenities. This strategy could work well in conjunction with a planned action, which is our next strategy. Using a planned action as a tool to streamline the review and permitting process and reduce the SEPA costs of individual projects. The county would need to identify where planned actions could be useful. So in both of these cases, I think what we're talking about is doing environmental review for larger areas, either a sub area or a larger area, so that when more specific actions or projects take place, if they meet the local requirements and the larger area has already gone through an environmental review, they wouldn't have to go through further environmental review. And then C 2.3, write code that would provide a SEPA exemption for small scale infill development. That pertains to the county's comprehensive plan. And if that comprehensive plan has had some level of environmental review, then those specific infill projects, as long as they don't exceed density targets, would not have to go through additional environmental review. And Jackie and other county staff, if I misrepresent any of these, feel free to jump in. C-3, other administrative actions. Consider a time limit or limited supply strategy for the development of certain housing types, such as ADUs, by offering financial incentives or impact fee waivers for the first number of projects or for the first period of time. This is a strategy that's meant to encourage those targeted housing types for projects to get started sooner rather than later. C 3.2, partner with community groups to host ADU workshops to share information about ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and for networking with builders and lenders. And 3.3, create a housing demonstration project or pilot program to test how well a certain new housing type would fit within the community and address community housing needs. We have more strategies under this other administrative actions category. 3.4, develop a communication/education plan for new changes to code or other housing options strategies, such as handouts and brochures explaining new regulations. I believe we've discussed similar strategies in previous meetings that had to do with either printed materials or online materials that provide education, but also we've talked about having an actual staff person that can help facilitate these types of things. And then finally, 3.5, monitor housing development over time, noting things like the number and type of units produced, their size, density, parking, sale or rent levels, etc., and then reporting on those on an annual basis, just to provide more education to understand what actions are making a difference in terms of providing more affordable housing options. So really just monitoring and tracking housing development over time. So that is it for the other administrative actions category. Now we're going to move on to the second category we're covering this evening, which is other strategies, those strategies that didn't fit neatly within the other categories we've discussed. The first is legislative advocacy. These are both longer term in terms of timeline. We've made them longer term strategies. 1.1, support legislative changes to address issues with the state's condominium defect liability law that has contributed to a condominium construction drought by encouraging frivolous lawsuits. I think this has been an issue in both Oregon and Washington. 1.2, support legislative changes that would support locally owned rental housing instead of out-of-state ownership. So this strategy was added based on PAG discussion from previous meetings. We were not able to come up with a very specific strategy on how this would be accomplished, but we look forward to hearing in our smaller group discussions if anyone has any thoughts on how that could be accomplished. But it was basically a desire for housing to be built for existing Clark County residents versus people coming in from out of state. But certainly that's a interesting goal, but a tricky one to implement. So look forward to hearing what folks have to say about that. 2.1, accessibility. Adopting a visitability program, either with voluntary incentives and or code requirements for the construction of a percentage of new housing units that include the following visitability standards: a no-step barrier-free main entrance, a bathroom and small living area accessible to the main entrance, 32-inch wide internal doors between the entrance, the bathroom, and the living area for wheelchair accessibility. So some accessibility pieces there. Motel, hotel conversions to housing. This is 3.1. Write code that allows for the conversion of existing motels and hotels into permanent housing. This could be specifically for certain housing types, such as housing that meets certain affordability criteria. And then F4, getting into the weeds a little bit, revising in the county code the definitions of household, housekeeping unit, and family per this Senate bill to essentially remove requirements around the number of unrelated persons that would define a household or a family or occupy a dwelling unit, and really focus instead on having that defined through building safety code requirements rather than these arbitrary numbers. So that's those other strategies that didn't fit well in the other categories. We have a note in the chat here. I'm going to go back for a second. There's a request to define planned action. And I wonder if Jenna or Jackie, you might be able to define that a little better than I did. I know, Jenna, you had mentioned in particular the use of planned actions along with sub-area planning, but can someone maybe put a finer point on it than I was able to?
Sure, Steve. And we also have, for those that want to dig in deep, like we have a little bit of explanation also in the PDF document. But they are essentially an environmental analysis that's on an area-wide basis. So for example, we've used it for a sub-area plan where you would do an environmental analysis on the entire area so that all of the potential environmental impacts that you have planned for the certain types of development that are going to potentially occur are accounted for in that environmental analysis, so that when individual projects come in for development, they can be exempt from doing another environmental review. And please, anyone, if I've got that wrong, of staff, please jump in.
Hopefully that's helpful. Again, C 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3, I think all operate under the idea that you do some environmental planning for a broad area so that when you're doing more specific development activities or specific projects, you don't have to do another level of environmental analysis. Okay, we're going to go down to the final category, which is displacement strategies. I want to note that I think the real challenge here, or what we want folks to be thinking about, is what role should the county be playing in these different strategies, because we know we have partners in terms of the development community and the nonprofit community, and what really is the best role for the county to play here. And I'll also note that some of these strategies overlap with ones we've discussed previously. After today's meeting, we'll really sort through and simplify before we come back to you with a prioritized package of strategies. So I apologize, there's some overlap here, but let's be thinking about what role the county should play in these. So the first category here, which I noted overlaps with E4 and E5 from a previous meeting, mission-oriented acquisition funds or partnering with local housing providers. So 1.1, coordinate or support monitoring efforts on regulated affordable housing properties that are nearing their affordability expiration dates. I can't remember, Victor, I think you might have said that the Housing Authority does some monitoring like this, and or maybe the state does some monitoring of this. So, you know, the county might want to partner on that. Victor, you could do a thumbs up or down.
Yes.
The Housing Authority does do some monitoring.
So if we have funding on a project, or if there's project-based vouchers, we track. And then if you use State Housing Trust Fund or Washington State, like low-income housing tax credits, they track. And they have like a WebR system, which is how you update annually. But that's the only way. Like if we aren't involved in a project, we aren't tracking just market rate affordable housing in the community.
Okay, thank you, Victor. So, you know, there might be a niche role or a filling a gap role for the county, or it might be more working with that state monitoring and with other partners on that. 1.2, adopt a notice of intent to sell ordinance. This would be a requirement for owners of multifamily housing to make a public notice when they're intending to sell their property. That would allow public and nonprofit entities to prepare accordingly, and potentially tenants to have more time to prepare if they need to move. 1.3, explore partnerships and opportunities with community land trusts. So that is the G1 category. G2, manufactured home and tiny home communities. I note here that category B5, which we discussed at our last meeting, there's some overlap here. Really looking at what the county's role would be to, again, to support state programs and local partners. Strategy 2.1, provide resources and support with the mobile home park preservation and relocation assistance program, and mobile home park conversion to cooperative programs. So really looking at preserving those mobile home parks as a source of affordable housing. G3, tenant and homeowner protections and assistance. 3.1, continue renter assistance fund programs and support. Identify and address fund distribution equity issues. So that's kind of reviewing those programs to make sure that funds are being distributed equitably. 3.2, support state legislation that invests in affordable housing, rental assistance, and tenant protections. 3.3, expand existing home ownership, weatherization, rehabilitation, and energy assistance grants. I think those are all things the county is already doing. 3.4, host home buyer education program for renters on the home buying process and provide information on down payment assistance programs. Again, is that something the county should be hosting, or are other partners providing those activities and the county can support them? 3.5, provide information on foreclosure assistance, resources, and programs. Use eligible affordable housing funds to support foreclosure assistance and intervention programs, and or support community land trusts to purchase foreclosed properties and restore ownership for residents. 3.6, support legislative efforts that expand property tax assistance programs to people with low incomes who are elderly and or have a disability. G4, I think this is our last strategy, regulation of short-term rentals. The idea is that many communities have adopted short-term rental regulations to reduce their impact on displacement and housing affordability. Communities can track short-term rentals by requiring registration and then prepare policy regulations that reduce the likelihood of long-term rentals converting into short-term rentals. 4.1 is simply to research short-term rental impacts in Clark County, and if needed, to develop a county policy around short-term rentals. All right, so that is a brief introduction to the strategies we're going to discuss in our groups. The questions that we would like our PAG members to answer and the rest of you to listen in on and then provide your comments during the public comment section is, which of these strategies are a high priority in terms of achievability and timeline, which are important but maybe a little bit longer term, and then which are not impactful strategies that and maybe should be removed from consideration. The second question is, are we missing any strategies within these broad categories? So this is our last chance for all of you to say, well, not necessarily the last chance, but if there are strategies you've been thinking about that you haven't seen over the past 3 months, now is a good time to raise those so we can add them to our comprehensive list. With that, I'll ask Jenna if we are ready for our to go into our breakout groups.
We are ready.
Okay, I will mention Jenna and Jackie, please record your session. For those interpreting or using the sign language interpretation function, you may have to reestablish that when you move into the small group. So Jenna might have to do a few things there. So please be patient, but we'll get that started as quickly as possible. Jenna, in terms of timing, are we going to come back in about an hour or 4:30? How did you set it up?
Yeah, I set it up for an hour. If we happen to be moving quicker, I'll check in with you, Steve. So, but at the longest, we'll be back in an hour.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks everyone, and have a good discussion. Let's go ahead. Okay, we are recording. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, but I'm going to use the handout. Just bear with me for a moment, because it provides a little bit more information if we need it. All right. Okay. Okay. So we will start with permitting process streamlining. And we've got Commissioner Barca and Brian and Julia and Victor with us, and Dan and Mark in terms of our PAG members. And thanks to others for listening in. So let's start with 1.1, permitting the majority of residential uses through a type 1 review rather than a type 2 review and approval. Do we have any thoughts or comments on that strategy? Ron, I know you have to have some thoughts on this one.
All right, so why isn't this just normal standard operating procedure anyway? Why is this a special thing that we have to put together?
I mean, I think this would make it a standard operating procedure, right? Are you asking
Yeah.
why it's not already the general practice in Clark County?
Yeah, it makes me wonder that we have some data that says this isn't the case, and I don't know if that's true. I know that the development community often complains about how long it takes to get a project permitted. And I think the county should be taking that information and continuing to try and improve their process. But if we were to ask community planning, would they not think that they're already doing this?
Well, let's have, maybe Susan can enlighten us a bit, and then Julie, I see you have your hand raised. Let's go to you after Susan comments.
So I guess I would just say, I think this is an interesting discussion item. The main difference between the different, the type 1 and the type 2 is the timeframes that it's reviewed in under. This is not completely true, but a lot of the standards for type 1s and type 2s are actually the same. I think this is very aspirational. I think there are a lot of residential projects that are reviewed, and so I think getting the type 1, once an application is fully complete, which basically means you have all of the information you need to review it, a type 1 takes 21 days and a type 2 takes 78 days. So it would be a significant cut in the review time period. I think additional staffing might be necessary to allow that, but that's the main difference.
So Susan, we should probably update the table in terms of cost and administrative effort to this strategy. We have it as low cost and low administrative effort, but I'm hearing from you that it might be a little bit more than, might fall into the medium range.
I would agree with that. I'm not sure that it could be done with the current levels of staffing.
Okay, Julia?
Thanks. I think Susan answered part of my question, and that was just a basic overview about the differences between the type 1 and the type 2 review. So I understand one has a different timeline, but is there a different amount of things that are reviewed or scope of review? In 3 sentences or less, please.
Yes, there is a different amount of information that is reviewed, and slightly different standards or review criteria.
So from our PAG members, are we generally in support of this strategy? Brian, you have any comments?
I agreeing with Susan's comments, and I guess thinking of this just personally as more of a second tier criteria, priority level. I forget how you phrase the different priority levels, Steve, but I think this can help. There's probably some changes at the margin in this regard that can help. I don't know that this will be a driver of more housing affordability. And I guess given the total number of different recommendations we have among, what is it, A through G, I think if we don't do some serious prioritizations, the scope of our work will have a lot less meaning. So I do think we need to unfortunately make some hard prioritization choices. And for me, at least, this doesn't rise to the top.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate that. Others, top priority. Does anyone feel it's a top priority versus, like Brian said, more of a second tier priority? Okay. Okay, if there's no other comments on that one, then I'll move to 1.2, develop pre-approved model plans for ADUs or any other targeted housing types that can be built with type 1 approval. There's examples from other communities. Has anyone worked with a program like this or have any thoughts on how effective this might be in terms of encouraging more housing development?
This is Ron. I have seen some places where I think when we come down to the idea of having pre-approved models, I have seen shovel-ready projects that have pre-approved models be able to go through the planning process and come to fruition in pretty short order. The only drawback I've seen to that is communities appear to get to be quite homogeneous in the look of the area, but I don't think that that would be our issue per se, because I think we're going to be dealing a lot more with open space that is more of an infill scenario as opposed to large swaths of greenfield type development. So I see this as being a great opportunity. I think the middle housing needs to be really emphasized in this regard. And ADUs, I think, can come along in pretty short order, but to solve the kinds of problems we're really talking about, we've already kind of emphasized that middle housing is one of our big gaps. So I would really want to make sure that this is going to address something in the form of middle housing.
Thank you, Ron. Others? Julia, you had your hand up for a moment. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Yeah.
I just wanted to comment that I reviewed the resources that were provided for Lacey, Washington, about the kind of shovel-ready design for the variety of ADUs. I like the scope. They provided a variety of housing sizes and designs, which I think might get at some of Ron's concerns about a uniformity of design. And also, I think that that particular municipality has worked through some of the concerns about implementing a kind of pre-approved design process that we might be able to learn from and adopt if possible.
Thank you. Victor, Brian, Dan, Mark, any thoughts on this, where this falls in our priorities? Victor?
No, I like it. I just think it has to be coupled with other items, like you have to figure out, like, are you going to require parking that we touched on the other sections, and then the incentives to help finance it? Because I mean, it is expensive to put an ADU in, so whatever incentives you can offer up as well. So it's sort of like a package deal, like you have to touch on it in a few different areas.
Great. Brian, anything to add?
No, I agree completely with Victor. I think for this to move the needle, it does have to be coupled with other provisions. We've kind of taught, and we've taken, not me personally, but the city has looked a little bit at this about some pre-approved standards, and so far at least we've concluded that the amount of work it would take to make those standards really useful and really result in additional units is something we just don't have the resources for at this point. So I like the idea. Again, I don't think it's going to be a driver of affordable housing.
Understood. Okay, let's move on to one. Oh, Mark?
Yeah, I just reinforce some of those comments, and in particular, things that will incentivize the initiation of some of these infill projects. So I think, as Brian mentioned, the city has done some really good incentivizing of accessing properties and facilitating zone changes, those sort of things. So I think there should be an emphasis in that arena to help facilitate that these things start out, especially when somebody's got something new that's going to play out. The jurisdiction can do a huge positive impact that way.
Great. Good role for the county then. Okay. All right, 1.3, again, as I mentioned when I presented this or introduced this, streamlining land use, engineering, and building permit reviews. We noted a few options here. This certainly isn't a comprehensive list, but we talked about expedited permitting for targeted residential projects, supporting electronic plan review, and looking at reducing certain requirements or standards if a project meets certain other requirements. So I don't know if people want to talk about this in general, or if there are any more specific ideas that people say, you know what, an incentive or streamlining incentive that would really be helpful would be, X, Y, or Z if we meet other requirements. So just want to open up the floor on this one and hear your thoughts.
Well, I think affordable housing should get an expedited review. I'm sorry, everyone already knew I was going to say that.
Yeah.
And then the electronic plan review, or at least electronic submittals, would be nice, especially during COVID. We had quite the challenge submitting a project, and sort of got the runaround at the county. And then to get the same set of plans stamped, our architect literally had to drive to meet people in like Walmart parking lots. So that seems a little bit ridiculous.
And Victor, I understand on the electronic submittals, certainly, when you say affordable housing to get expedited review, is there any specific, level at which you think they should get expedited review?
Yeah, that's the part though. It's like when we submit for permits, we don't have all of our funding locked in place. So it's hard to show documentation that I have a use covenant in place. So that would be the tricky part.
Okay. Thank you. I wouldn't have known that. Great. Brian, Julia, Ron?
Well, one thing I think the saying affordable instead of targeted, I think, for me at least, hits more on what we're looking at. This is also the third bullet, I think, is also of some interest because it's not just the process, it's the actual functional standards. And I think there may be some room to do some things differently for affordable housing projects.
Okay. Any other thoughts on 1.3?
I will reiterate what Victor and Brian have said. I think changing that word targeted specifically to affordable will also force the county to actually adopt terminology of what affordable means, which I think is super important for us to go forward with. We don't have an agreement on what affordable means. And the idea of electronic plan review, yeah, it'd be nice to join the century and move forward with the thought process of being able to adopt things through the web and internet, because this is not new. It's, it's time to get past the paper to solve things. So I think those things are really important. The third bullet, I think it almost falls into the earlier category of C 1.1. It's just the idea that it's really important. It should be an initiative already, but I don't think we can couple it with other items. Otherwise, we'll drag the process down waiting for it.
All right. Before we move on, I just want to make clear that, we've talked about a lot about our project objectives have two different, we have two different objectives, one for affordable housing and one that's a little bit more akin to middle housing. And I'm hearing for 1.3 in terms of streamlining, we think that should be applied not to necessarily to the middle housing types, but definitely to affordable housing. Am I hearing that correctly? Not that it wouldn't at all be for middle housing, but I'm hearing the priority is affordable housing. However we end up defining it, as Ron mentioned. Okay, I saw some nods. Okay. Let's move to C2. Did my best to explain this, not my area of expertise, but all three of these have to do, again, with broader environmental approval happening and then more specific development projects not needing to go through additional environmental review if they're part of that broader environmental review. Any thoughts or comments on this, or anyone come across situations where this has come into play and these strategies would be, a high priority in terms of making affordable housing more feasible or middle housing more feasible? Are we thinking not a high priority?
I have some concerns about how it would really work. My knowledge of SEPA is the broader the area, the more opportunity there is for NIMBY type obstruction to a project. So if we try to apply this, say, like to the Vancouver urban growth area as a large generality, it seems like you would have a constant influx of individuals challenging the validity of it. You have multiple watersheds that you have to deal with, and I think you'd have to touch each and every one of them. So I'm not familiar with how this would actually work. Brian, perhaps you have an example of where this has been done in the past that would make it seem valid?
Yeah, I can try. I mean, we for instance, on the Heights development in central Vancouver, which just recently was approved, that is also subject to a planned action. These generally only work on very large scale developments because they require front loading of SEPA and doing an EIS at the outset. And so a typical affordable housing development, that's going to be a big time and expense factor. So in the Heights example, we did have affordable housing thresholds. I can't remember what they were required there. So in that sense, I guess the planned action might have helped that a little bit. But for me, at least, the bigger takeaway was that it might be useful to have a recommendation that when doing a large scale sub-area plan, or you could include private large scale mixed use developments, to include have some level of affordable housing be required, because it's, you know, as you get to a bigger scale, it's not as hard to include it. We recently approved a private development, the Vancouver Innovation Center at the former HP site, where 200 acres mixed use, where the applicant indicated a willingness to consider affordable housing provided the city changed its multifamily tax exemption requirements. So in other words, there was an indication that the affordable housing could be placed physically within the space without ruining things, making it harder to market other properties and so forth. They just wanted, the applicants just wanted some ability to be compensated for that. So I'm not sure the planned action itself is going to help that much with affordable housing. It's not a bad idea. Maybe there's some angles there, but I just think that when you're talking about big scale developments, it's not that hard to require. And I'm not talking about an individual apartment building. I'm talking about a larger mixed use. It's not that hard to require some level of affordable housing be included.
Thanks, Brian. And I'll note that both the planned action, the infill and the sub area plan pieces have some have a safe harbor for cities, but not for counties in terms of appeals based on SEPA, back to what Ron was saying, but that it appears that does not extend to counties. So so your concern, Ron, of a number of appeals would be valid for at the county level. Any other thoughts on these strategies? I appreciate your contributions there, Brian. Okay. C3, other administrative actions. The first is something that Elizabeth Decker suggested, which is considering a time limit or a limited supply strategy for the development of certain housing types, such as ADUs, by offering financial incentives or fee waivers for the first, certain number of projects or in the first 2 years in an effort to get some of those projects going. I know, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I know that in Portland, for instance, after ADUs were, the regulations around ADUs were opened up, it's taken a long time to see any real movement in terms of the number of ADUs developed. So any thoughts on that strategy?
It appears like it could be a valid incentive if you try and market it as if there's a certain scarcity. So like impact fee waivers and get people in line because of that, talking about there's a limited supply of a number of units that would be allowed an impact fee waiver. I think it's going to be as important as anything is to understand what's really preventing people from wanting to do it now more than the idea of saying this, but, one or two types of incentives. But certainly I think incentives are important towards the idea of winning the public over. And when I say the public, I'm talking about people who would be implementing ADUs on their own property. It could very well help in the context of tying it in with that short-term rental moratorium or limitation that we're talking about later.
Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, I would just reinforce many of Ron's comments. And part of my comment ties back to the question about what's the scope and scale of the impact of the proposed project. It seems to me some of these incentives should be tied to some sort of criteria that helps differentiate and then tie that to this incentivizing of launching a campaign like this so that people can see that, over the next year, you have the opportunity to do this and you're going to lose that if you don't. So some of that sort of thinking about, how do we get the market excited about the opportunity? And, some of that sort of thinking needs to play into this pretty deeply.
Thanks, Mark. And we will, when we do come back at the end of October, we will be trying to put a much finer point on some of these strategies than, these discussions, which have been more general in nature. But so thanks for that. Julia.
I have a question for my colleagues on the project advisor group who have more experience with housing and development in our area. And that's in response to CU 3.1. One of the ideas is that we provide incentives or waivers in the first 2 years. And I'm just curious about what the potential market might be to attract. How many ADU units might we permit in that period of time? What's the interest in the community for something like this?
Anyone have a feeling for Susan? Yeah. Mark, go ahead.
I would go ahead.
No, go, Mark.
So I would say that's a hard question to answer because the market's not familiar with the opportunity. And you have to go look at communities where they have incentivized this and what has the track record shown. And in my mind, the key piece of this is whatever we can do strategically that mobilizes the mom and pops who see this as an opportunity to either maintain their presence on their property, help them out a little bit, or even from more of a social benefit standpoint, want to have a hand in helping to solve part of the homeless issue at whatever scale or angle they want to take. So you're poking at something that we are really struggling with, and I think we've got to create that culture of desire for that kind of development to happen. But I just think we're on the precipice of moving some good things forward. So I guess that's the only way I could say it right now.
Susan?
I'm just trying to see, I know we have data on the number of ADUs, but I'm trying to very quickly look at what that is. I didn't put this together, so I don't want to give you
That's fine.
incorrect information here.
You can jump back in when you find it.
Okay.
No, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Victor.
When I worked in Colorado, I think we did a lot of research into this, and the biggest barrier is like folks want to do it. It's just that the financing around it is complicated. So I know before I left, they were looking at sort of like a revolving loan fund that's like a super low interest rate, so that folks could take out a loan. And then if you kept it affordable for a certain period of time, you let a portion of that get forgiven. So I think there's sort of the part that the county can do, which is sort of the make it easier to actually get it, and then waiving those fees. But then I think you have to partner with an entity that has funding that's disposable, or someone willing to do like a pilot program.
Thanks. Brian?
Yeah, I agree with those comments about needing some various incentive structures. It's still pretty expensive to build particularly a detached ADU 80,000, 100,000, you hear numbers like that. It's a lot of money. A couple of years ago, we liberalized our rules by no longer requiring the on-street parking or permanent or live-in resident of the main unit. And the market did respond somewhat, but not dramatically. These things take time. So I think we were maybe doing 5 to 10 units a year, and now we're probably doing, I would say, ballpark twice that. So it takes a while, I think, for the market to recognize it, but also we just need to do something about the financing of these things to make them happen.
Okay, Susan?
Yeah, so unofficially, it looks like in 2019, we had 37 ADUs. In 2020, we had 38. And so far through the end of July, we had 12 in 2020.
Okay. All right, let's move on here.
I just want to add one thing really quick.
Okay.
So I think Victor's point is really key in this, and the municipalities, agencies have a lot of way in this in terms of helping to create some partnership infrastructure that allows the financing of some of this stuff to be played out in different than just regular market means. And so I think some of those components really need to be looked at deeply if we're going to really create a true incentive, because it's got to be simple enough that folks want to jump for it and go for it. So.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Let's look next, 3.2, which is partnering with community groups to host ADU workshops, share information about ADUs, network with builders and lenders. Any experience with doing that, success stories or otherwise, or general feelings on 3.2?
This is Ron. This really feels like, to me, it's back to the aspect of when we bring this out, what is our marketing plan? I've had the experience with community land trusts that people don't understand them. They don't understand how they fit into them. I think that's the same situation here. I think there's probably a lot of opportunities to look at the aspect of how ADUs could play a role in going from, necessarily hardship housing down to the idea of affordable rentals in the community without adversely impacting. But I think this is really going to be one in which there's good marketing and positive acclaim from people that have taken the steps to try it. And we're going to have to continue to modify what we're doing to make sure that there is positive acclaim if we go ahead and use this tool.
Thank you, Ron. Mark, did you have something on this one, or is your hand up from before?
Still up from before, thanks.
Okay.
I just fully endorse it, thanks.
All righty. 3.3, I mean, these are related, and 3.4 are related to some degree. Create a housing demonstration project or pilot program, I think, is something along the lines of what Victor said earlier. And then 3.4 is creating a marketing or communication plan around these strategies. Anything to add that we haven't already said about the previous two strategies? No? Okay. And then 3.5 is really monitoring housing development over time, looking at the units produced, sizes, parking, sale or rent level, what incentives were used, et cetera, so that we've got some good data going forward, and we understand which of the strategies we're implementing has the most impact. Any reason not to do this one? Any thoughts, specific thoughts on this strategy? Okay. All right, let's move forward to these other strategies. The first two being legislative advocacy. Number one, for condominium defect around the condominium defect liability law. And the second, well, let's pause there. I know I've heard a lot about this one over the years. Is this a priority strategy? Maybe it seems like it might be more for middle housing than for affordable housing, but how much does this come into play for those who have been, in your worlds, how much has this issue come into play? Victor?
Yeah, we tried to do a homeownership condo project, but yeah, the insurance associated with the project just made it infeasible to actually keep it affordable for the home buyer. And then I'm on the board of Proud Ground, which does community land trust. And so they tried to develop a project in Portland, and they ran into the same issue where the insurance needed to cover the project for the construction defect was, I think, north almost $1 million. And so, it's like impossible to make it an affordable homeownership project in a condo structure. So I think you sort of limit it to just single family homes and townhomes. Because I think if it's less than 9 units, you don't trigger something like that, construction defects.
Okay. So this, you've seen this have real impacts on projects. That's important to know. Ron?
Yeah, this has been a big issue for quite some time now, and I think it has really put a damper on our choices of what we get in the way of middle housing. So in the context of middle housing, we've had times where developers have come to the Planning Commission and wanted different kinds of housing options because they had come in with the thought process of doing townhomes, and we're not going to enter into the market with that regard. I think, once again, without any housing option policy in place, this is something that I think really needs to be solved. And I think it has to be a high priority for the county and our local state legislators to be all in one voice on the matter. And I think it affects every city and the county as well. So from the context of middle housing, I think it has really exasperated, that's not the right word. It's made it a lot worse for middle housing in a time when it's already bad.
Thanks, Ron. Julia, Brian, Mark, Dan? Sounds like a pretty high priority though. Okay, 1.2 is, again, this came from just comments from PAG members about the desire for the units that are created or local, new housing development to go to local renters instead of out of state ownership. We don't know any strategy that can facilitate that desired objective. Curious to see if any of you have any thoughts on that goal and if there's a way to achieve it. I think we saw in the work from Echo Northwest that a lot of housing that gets developed ends up going to folks from out of state. But I don't know how we stop that other than just trying to build to the demographics of Clark County that we've identified.
Well, I think just looking at our local builders here and kind of how Clark County is operating, I think the vast majority of our local building is local. I think this is an issue maybe for bigger cities like LA or Seattle. I don't think there's any way we can even support any type of change.
Any other thoughts on that? That's kind of where we were coming from, consultant and staff. We couldn't think of ways to do that, but well, if anyone has any brilliant ideas or something they've been wanting to get out, let us know. F2, accessibility. This is really some, I hadn't heard this term visitability, but it was really looking at some of these maybe ADA related accessibility measures, no step barrier free main entrance, accessible bathroom to the main entrance and living area, wider doorways to allow for wheelchair accessibility. I guess what I'm not familiar with is how, if these are already required in any types of development, or if it's all, what's required and what's not. So I'd be curious to hear people's experience with making units accessible to more folks.
Brian, this is already a rule for the city of Vancouver, right?
We're looking at it,
Okay.
and we're modeling some of that look after what Ridgefield has in terms of existing building permit incentives. And so we hope to include something like this within our building fee structure, some incentives to see if we can move the needle a bit. I haven't checked with Ridgefield's experience in the last, say, 6 months. I don't think they received a whole lot of additional development that met these standards with their incentives. My general understanding is that the hardest one to do obviously is the no step barrier free main entrance. And just in doing brief research on this, the jurisdictions that do this tend to be in the middle of the country where land is flat. But that said, I think it's worthwhile to have it as an incentive where possible. And by do this, I mean those are jurisdictions that some actually required it. And we envision we'll have something within our building permit structure.
Brian, do you know what kind of incentive Ridgefield offers?
I forget. I should know that. It's how deep a discount it is. It's on building permit fees. It's
okay.
Essentially cheaper fees. I forget how much it is.
Okay. All right. If there's no comments there, I'm going to move on to F3, writing code that allows for the conversion of existing motels and hotels into permanent housing. This could be specified for certain housing types that meet certain affordability criteria. I think, if I recall, I think this might have come from staff. Susan, is that something that's not allowed currently, or do you know?
It would depend. Well, assumably the hotel motel would be in a commercial district, and housing in commercial district is right now limited to second story.
Okay.
So I would say it's not allowed specifically right now.
Okay. Any opinions on this? Is it a priority? High, medium, low?
Well, isn't Vancouver Housing Authority looking to buy any kind of available hotel motel complex that's in the market already? And I think without regard to what the county would like to do, I think there's already a program to try and convert everything that would become available on the market. Is that not true?
Yeah, we just purchased a hotel earlier this year to convert it into a shelter. And then at the state level, they rolled out a program specifically for this purpose to target hotels and motels to get converted into either homeless shelters or permanent supportive housing. So there is a push with funding behind it for this. So I think it's a good priority to have.
Great. Brian?
Yeah, I'm finally realizing I should raise my hand here. Sorry.
That's okay.
I think Susan put her finger on the biggest barrier to this is that yes, typically hotels and motels are in commercially zoned land, which would limit the degree to which you can build residential. And so I think this might be some low hanging fruit of either allowing under certain conditions or with a certain review, affordable housing or even whatever types of housing from converted hotels, or if a rezone is necessary, indicating that it would be, one factor in support of the rezone. So I like this.
Great. Anyone else? Go ahead, Mark. No? Okay.
What?
I didn't know if you had something to say, Mark.
I would just add that I feel like it should be allowed outright.
Okay.
Or maybe not outright, but I guess putting some guardrails on like what you mean by approval of it, because we got quite a bit of pushback when we purchased the hotel to convert it into a shelter. So I think very fortunate that both Clark County councilors and the City of Vancouver City Council were both in support, but the community was not very excited. for this use going in. So I guess just knowing, like, you know, it's allowed outright in the city of Vancouver for what we're doing. So
Okay, thanks for that clarification. And I saw the thumbs up from Dan. Thanks, Dan. Okay, F4, this is looking at the definition of household. Susan, do you want to say anything about this? It's okay to pass if you don't, but you might be a little more familiar with it. But I think it's just taking out the commenting on what comprises a household versus looking to those, you know, building code and safety regulations to define how many people can be in a unit.
We do have pretty outdated definitions in our code that need to be revised. So I would say this is probably similar to Brian's comment. This is low hanging fruit and it needs to be done anyways to be in compliance with state law.
Okay. That seems pretty straightforward. Any comments on that? Thumbs up from Ron. Great. Okay, let's move to these displacement strategies. Again, I think there's a little overlap from things we've talked about previously. I see we have about 10 minutes left here. This first strategy, and this is why I asked you, Victor, because I wasn't around. I was on vacation and other folks were working on this document. So I wanted to make sure that the Housing Authority was indeed monitoring efforts. So I think the strategy should actually be a little bit broader than just supporting VHA monitoring efforts, but you know, working with you, monitoring the state monitoring efforts, and then maybe filling gaps as needed for multifamily housing, monitoring different types of affordable housing properties as they near their expiration dates. Ron?
Yeah, I think this has got to be a really high priority. If nothing else comes out of this group, the idea of having defined standards for what the terminology means and having a monitoring process in place to give ourselves a scorecard for the county in relationship to the cities to understand how we're doing. I think it's vital for us. Otherwise, we won't have any way of understanding whether we're succeeding or not. And that's the beginning of the whole thing. You have to measure it to be able to change it.
Thank you, Ron. Anyone else have comments on the monitoring piece? I think there's some overlap with one of the strategies from a bit earlier. The second is adopting a notice of intent to sell ordinance where multifamily owners, I don't know if it's only for affordable or not, but would be required to make a public notice when they're going to sell the property. Any objections to this one? Any specific thoughts on this one?
I just think this is probably one of the more important ones, especially for that, you know, with market rate affordable housing. So there are no restrictions, but, you know, the condition of the building might make it stay affordable. But if a market rate developer purchases it and, you know, fixes everything up and increases the rents, it pushes people out. So I think having this ordinance allows mission-driven nonprofits the opportunity to purchase it first.
Thank you, Victor. Any other comments on 1.2? Thumbs up from Ron. Great. 1.3, explore partnerships and opportunities with community land trusts. It's pretty brief, but I know, Ron, you were talking about land trusts earlier. I'm trying to remember now if there is an active land trust in Clark County, Greater Clark County, in our study area.
Oh, sorry, I should raise my hand.
Go ahead, Ron, and then Victor.
Yeah, I think Proud Ground is working on behalf of Vancouver Housing Authority in some aspect. I think they're doing more like a down payment a program. And I think the one thing about community land trusts where the land is held in trust in the county gives us a better opportunity to keep it affordable That's one of the things that I think with any of our subsidy choices is having a method of knowing that the subsidy continues to pay a dividend back to the community and it isn't just a one-time venture. So I think in the context of community land trust, I think it's really important to have something that ties the land together. And I see them working in many, many places, but they haven't been able to get off the ground here in the county.
Okay, Victor.
Yeah, just on what Ron said. So yeah, Proud Ground operates in the entire sort of Portland metro region.
Right.
And so for them, though, any house anywhere in the county can be added to the community land trust. It isn't like, I think, I think folks think of like sort of like a mobile home community where there's like a group of homes in the land trust, but really it's just scattered site community land trust. Because even like properties out on the Oregon coast are in the land trust. And they did receive funding from Clark County. I think they received home or CDBG funds for down payment assistance, but that house will still roll into the land trust. And we also just were awarded funds at the state level between VHA and Proud Ground to continue that. So it's happening. It's just
Awesome.
They're getting outbid even with down payment assistance
Mhm.
on homes.
Okay. Thanks, Victor. Okay. We talked about this last time, but several times around manufactured homes and tiny home communities. I know Ron led a tour of some tiny homes for PAG members. County to provide resources and support with mobile home park preservation and relocation assistance program. I'm not sure who operates that program. It's written as if it exists. And mobile home park conversion to cooperative programs. Is anyone actively working on this right now that you all are aware of? Mobile home park preservation and relocation assistance program? So I was under the impression that that's something new that would need to be worked on, and it's not existing, but I defer to those of you who are a little more in the know than I am. So a little more research maybe is needed on this one. We'll go ahead and do that research before we convene with you all again. Let's move to G3, and these are these different tenant and homeowner protections and assistance programs. Again, I'm not exactly sure what role the county plays or what other agencies are doing. But 3.1, continue renter assistance fund programs and support, identify where there are fund distribution equity issues and implement changes to address those issues moving forward. I'll just go through all these since we're short on time. 3.2, support state legislation that invests in affordable housing, rental assistance, and tenant protections. I think, Jenna just said 10 minutes left for discussion, so we have a little more time. Again, we talked a lot about county role for these things. I think supporting state legislation seems easy enough. 3.3, expand existing homeownership, weatherization, rehabilitation, and energy assistance grants, which is something the county is already doing. 3.4, host a homebuyer education program. I'm not sure if that's a role for the county or if others are already doing that and the county would just support those efforts. And then 3.5, foreclosure assistance, providing information on foreclosure assistance resources and programs. So thoughts, one more. Support state legislative efforts that expand property tax assistance programs to people with low incomes who are elderly and or have a disability. So thoughts on these, I guess, 6 strategies all around tenant and homeowner assistance programs. Do we know who is currently providing these programs? If it's the county, I mean, I know the county is doing some of the weatherization and some of those grant programs, but how about things like renter assistance funds or foreclosure assistance? Is there a community partner that's providing those services currently? Or is that something that we need to look into developing?
Some of that may be done through community services.
Okay. Thank you, Oliver.
You're welcome.
Any thoughts about these strategies, how where they fall on our list of priorities as we move to the next phase of looking at prioritization? Ron?
Yeah, I think these are all probably very important in the context of displacement strategy and prevention of displacement. It feels like the funding sources, either the state is administering federal money or passing down money to the county to administer. They all seem very familiar in that regard. I would ask the group, is there any of these services that we believe are just not being offered today? I believe, as I look at it, they're all being offered in one format, perhaps not adequately, but they are being offered.
Thanks, Ron. And I'll follow up with staff, and we'll come back. You know, if there are gaps here, we'll come back with strategies around those specific gaps. To your point that we think that these, and to Oliver's point, that many of these services may be provided through community services. The last strategy that we have is the regulation of short-term rentals. I talked a bit about this earlier in terms of long-term rentals being converted to, to short-term rentals. We see that some examples of strategies are restricting short-term rentals to zones, allowing tourist accommodations, capping the number of rentals per host. In residential zones, limiting the number of nights that a short-term renter can be rented to guests annually, permitting short-term rentals with an owner-occupied residence, and requiring permanent residence occupancy. So I know there communities are dealing with these different levels of importance depending on where those communities are, what tourism activity looks like. What do we think is a right approach for Clark County? We've written the strategy to say, research short-term rental impacts in Clark County, and if needed, develop a county policy around short-term rentals. Is that the right strategy at this point in time? Ron says yes.
I think we're at that point. I think we're at that point right now where we need to put that policy in place.
You think so, Dan? Are you saying that you think? Do you know of issues around short-term rentals, or you're just saying that kind of figuring out what the impacts are and then responding accordingly is the right approach?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we need to address it now. I mean, we're becoming more of a tourism hotbed, and I mean, I think now would be the time to address it.
Okay. Okay, that is the end of the strategies that we presented. I'm wondering, and you're obviously welcome to throw these out there anytime they occur to you, but are there other strategies that over the past 3 months that we have not discussed that the county should really be considering as we look to develop our recommendations? Anything we haven't heard? Ron, go right ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know whether anybody took the time to look at what I submitted a couple of meetings back, but the county had an infill ordinance, which it repealed. I think the infill ordinance is wholly appropriate for us to bring back and readdress, specifically trying to understand where it could be valid and valuable to the community. And the other thing is, I think we really need to have a good discussion about smaller lot sizes with proportionally smaller housing to go with it. So we could keep a footprint that looks proportional, and at the same time give people middle housing options. So a smaller lot, smaller house, but keep us in the price range where we believe in our community we can afford in the middle housing, which I think we've defined early in the process of 350,000 or less. So I think there's opportunities to go much lower than that if we're able to divide property into smaller footprints, 1,500 square feet, 2,000 square feet. So I think those things can play a big role, and it depends on whether we use it as infill or just a development option in the residential area.
All right, just getting that all down. Thank you, Ron. And we did, receive your proposal from a while ago. I'm sorry if we didn't incorporate it into this round, but we'll be sure to do so into our prioritized list. Dan gave a thumbs up to those two issues that you raise. So I will get those into the hopper for the next round. Brian.
Oh, I don't know that it would be the centerpiece of any affordable housing strategy, but or housing options, but just sort of in the way of a nudge, I think it would be useful requiring residential development proposals to indicate what they're likely to be charging, either for rent or for purchase. And certainly when a development like a site plan is coming in for an apartment, they will know that. And in most cases, I think on a rezone that will probably be known. And it's obviously just an estimate, but I think if the price of housing and is so important to public policy, which it is, I think having some sense of what that is, what the at least and knowing that earlier in the development process is helpful for everyone.
Would the idea, Brian, be to be tying some of the incentives and different tools that we talked about to those levels?
That could flow out of it, but I think the first thing is just to know as you're looking at a subdivision or a site plan or a rezone to then allow a subdivision or site plan, what's the likely where's it going to fall in the market? In some cases on rezones, we will ask that question, and there's no obligation to answer it. In some cases, it's estimated. In some cases, not. But I think it would be helpful just to have that information as best could be estimated up front.
Great, thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on Brian's commentary, and I think it's critical that the incentives that we build have to be tied to some specific impact that the proposal is making towards dealing with the household and housing problem. So there has to be a direct tie to that. I just can't see, it's a voluntary opportunity to participate or not. And I can't see us being able to administer it and assure accountability and the opportunity to be transparent enough so everybody sees that this is a great way to play. And so it just has to be a key factor of this thing. It comes back to the monitoring and accountability piece. So it has to be fundamentally included.
Thank you, Mark. And Ron, briefly, I think we're supposed to rejoin the room. So if you can give us your brief comments, and then we'll leave the room and join the main room.
So briefly, it's just a matter of the declaration allows us then to have some information that we can use for monitoring, which we said was vital.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate a great conversation. And I think we can go ahead and click on that leave room button you should have to join the main room. Okay. I think we have everyone back in the room together. Maybe if Jackie and Jenna have a minute or two to share any key observations from your group, let's go ahead and do that now.
Thanks, Steve. Jenna was so kind to do all our notes, so she's gonna give a couple, I think, highlights, and if any one of our advisor group members wants to weigh in on that, please do.
Okay, So a lot of good discussion, a lot of feedback and suggestions on things to consider for a lot of the strategies. So a few items that are standing out to me at the moment are talked a lot about the suggestion to move more residential projects into a type 1 review process. And there's a lot of discussion on, yes, desirable, but let's make sure it makes sense. Which projects does that make sense for? And then also the consideration of neighbors having input on project proposals, which you lose if you switch to a type 1 process. Also a lot of feedback on, process improvements and in terms of reviewing, engineering and building plans, and some suggestions on what's happened with other jurisdictions there. But I think in general, support to improve the process. Also got some suggestions on and support for demonstration projects and recommendation to look at what the city of Gresham is doing. And that seems to be a pretty unique approach to allowing folks to propose ideas that are different than what's allowed in current code. Support for, whatever the county can do to support manufactured home parks in their role, what makes sense there. There was support for that. Also, similar support for renter assistance and a lot of those suggestions that had the county in sort of a support role for assistance programs that are available. And then also in regards to some of the ADU suggestions, support as well to make that process easier for people who are interested in building ADUs. I'll stop there. Again, doesn't quite do justice to everything that was said.
Thanks, Jenna. I'm going to point out a few other things that our group thought were very important. Again, it's not comprehensive, but the code changes to allow motel and hotel conversions to housing stood out as an important one. The updating the definition of household, which is more of a bookkeeping thing, but has implications, is something, a low-hanging fruit that should be addressed. Working with, we had a lot of talk about the importance of having data and really monitoring existing affordable housing, whether it's subsidized or market rate, so that we have that data and information and monitoring over those over time, so we can respond accordingly if there's changes or gaps that need to be addressed. Same with, I think tied into that is the adopt a notice of intent to sell ordinance. I had several strategies throughout, I think, just talking about monitoring affordable housing units and types and sharing that information so that we have that data to build on. At the end, we asked if there were strategies that we hadn't talked about. There was mention of the repealed infill ordinance and needing to take another look at that and figure out where it could be valid and valuable. Also really focusing on smaller lot sizes and smaller housing that is going to allow us to provide units at the price levels that we think we need to address the gaps in the county's housing at this time. And then again, with the monitoring, looking at residential development proposals and having those proposers, applicants indicate what they're likely to be charging if it's a rent, whether it's a housing price or rental unit. Again, just the more information we have, the better equipped we are to adjust regulations and code and strategies to respond and to the county's needs. So with that, I'm going to share my screen again. And no, let me see if I can find the right one. There we go. And move to our public comment period. So, how to provide public comment via computer or mobile device. Click the raise hand icon to indicate that you would like to speak. I will acknowledge each person in turn to go ahead and unmute yourself or turn on your camera. And we ask that you limit your comment to no longer than 2 minutes. And when you're done, then you can click on the lower hand icon. And we'll work with our interpreters if anyone needs them to translate for the rest of the group what their question or comment is. So with that, I'll open up the public comment period and see if we have anyone, any of our community members who would like to share. Okay, I'm seeing Glenn right now. So Glenn, why don't you go ahead, turn on your camera and unmute yourself and share your comment.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I really wanted to be much more involved in this process. This is something that's near and dear to my heart and right in the thick of what I do for a living. I primarily am building ADUs nowadays, but I was extremely busy the last 6 months and was unable to fully participate. But I did come across a few things that I felt that were worth mentioning. One of the things that was discussed is something that as an ADU builder, I think really needs to be studied more. And that is the idea, and same thing with tiny housing. If we can have pre-formatted plans, pre-approved plans, that will totally change the process. I know it's a messy situation on how to get there. I mean, we need to be creative. Perhaps we can, have a fund to purchase the plans of people that are building them, plans that are already prepared, and maybe we can offer an incentive or something to them to, retain ownership of that plan. Because one of the tricky things are that it's hard to have, you can't have 4. You're gonna have to have a lot more than 4 just because everybody's, yards and areas are situated differently. So it'd be kind of like an inventory building. We'd have to come up with more and more plans. But I kind of cringe when I hear the term that resources aren't available for it. To me, what that means is that it's not a priority. I think that the resources are available for probably almost all of these plans. It's just a matter of prioritizing our funding. I heard a couple comments that I really appreciated. One was that we are talking about incentivizing some of these things, but really what we should be focusing on is finding out the barriers preventing these kinds of things from coming forward, and remove those barriers. Those should be the biggest priorities. I also liked the comment that we need to define the term affordable. We have the huge problem in Vancouver. That word is used all over the place and it virtually means nothing. So I think that it's very critical that we come up with a, agreed upon term, for what affordable actually is. Hopefully I'm not going over my time here. The city did an anti-displacement study, and I didn't see this, and I don't know if maybe this was brought up in any of the meetings that I missed, but the option for a right of first refusal for tenants of a house where the property owner is selling gives them the opportunity to purchase a project. And I don't know if it would be possible to use some sort of funding, perhaps affordable housing funding, to come in and basically put a down payment on the house that allows their payment to stay the same as what they were paying in rent, and a lien put on the home. When the home sells later on, that goes and replenishes the funding, the affordable housing fund or wherever it comes from. That would have to seriously be explored, because there would definitely be some unintended consequences to that. But it would be a great idea in terms of anti-displacement. And then the mobile home park preservation, I think we really need to dive into that, because that is if these places sell out, and I know personally I have a family member that lives in one inside of the county. And I mean, that just wreaks havoc on everybody's lives in there. And I think that's an asset that we should preserve in some way or another, but really needs to be studied, because again, there's always unintended consequences. And it's also difficult when you limit people, property owners' rights. So I would love to see more exploration on that. And then on, we talked a little bit, and I don't know how extensively it was through this whole conversation, but about tenant protections. I do believe in tenant protections, but that again, we have to be very, very careful. I just read an article, I think yesterday, that was talking about property owners that, just your average people that have 1 or 2 rentals, and they are exiting the market in Oregon because there have been so many restrictions placed that it puts them at too much risk. And it no longer is feasible for them to do. So we just have to be very careful with those items to make sure we don't tip the balance, too far and actually harm more than we help. So I appreciate all the information that you guys have gone through and the time that you spent to do this. This is an incredibly important conversation. And I hope that we can really push through some good policy changes that will benefit people and make housing more attainable in our county. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate those comments, and I hope you stay involved throughout the rest of the process. Is there anyone else from the public who would like to share some comments? Okay. Oh, BK, please go right ahead.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Karen. I work for Washington Advocates of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So I am an advocate for the deaf and hard of hearing. I'm here really appreciating all of this conversation about affordable housing. I work with the deaf and hard of hearing community a lot with housing needs. And so I wanted to raise some points that I have to advocate for the deaf and hard of hearing community, because that is a disability a little bit different than others. It is an invisible disability, not a visual one. So it doesn't mean, ramps. It doesn't mean things like for people in wheelchairs or something like that. It's more invisible. So will there be doorbells with lights or fire alarms with lights, things of that nature? Also, a lot of our community is on SSI or SSDI, so that's all really prevalent when coming up with affordable housing. And also, we're curious as well if the screening for applicants is going to change. Also, just like what's included with the screening when that comes about, just because we want to know more about how you can qualify, who doesn't qualify, things of that nature. Also, things like background history. How can somebody overcome if there's something in their background, then they're automatically denied if there's any sort of anything on their record, and then they're denied, but then where do they go? Also, one other thing when it comes to backgrounds and screenings, I know that we're particular about what is really labeled as homeless, but in our community, deaf people don't tend to actually go sleep on the streets because that's really dangerous for them. They will avoid doing that by any means, meaning they'll stay on a couch as much as they can because sleeping in the street is so dangerous, especially for a deaf person, since they can't actually fall asleep without knowing that they're safe. So, so then that also poses a problem when we've come to applying for affordable housing, because they don't have a permanent address, but they are couch surfing. So I just really wanted to drop our little feedback in here so that way you guys keep the deaf and hard of hearing community in mind. I appreciate the interpreter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bonnie. Appreciate all those comments, and I'll echo your thanks to our interpreters and those who are participating today who haven't in the past. We really welcome your participation, and thank you for joining us today. Any other public comments before we wrap up today's meeting? Oh, Stephen, do you have a comment? One of our interpreters can help. we can't hear the comment from our interpreter. Maybe, do we need to click on English? Let's see here. Maybe others can hear and I can't.
Can you hear the interpreters?
Yep, click for those who couldn't hear like me, go ahead and click on interpretation at the bottom and then on English.
Can you
Okay.
hear this interpreter, Amanda?
I can hear you now. Thank you. Sorry for that.
So
Stephen, if you-
Amanda or Lisa or both of us?
right now I'm hearing Amanda.
Only Amanda? Okay.
Sorry, Stephen, if you could give your comment again, I apologize.
Okay, so when I recently moved here and I realized the cost for apartments have just increased dramatically. And with SSI, it's not as much. It's hard to meet those needs. So I'm just concerned about maybe like a studio or something, but then you have to have a roommate. So I wouldn't like to have a roommate. I prefer to live alone. So how could you meet the needs of those kind of people? I have a job and things like that, but one of my friends, very sweet lady, is struggling to find a place where she can live. She's deaf, plus is handicapped, needs a wheelchair, things like that. So apartments are very spendy. And I'm just getting a little frozen screen here.
We can hear you. We can see you.
And this woman is in the HUD housing and she's deaf. And my concern, she struggles with being disabled. She's at the bottom of the list in regards to having priority for housing. So a lot of deaf people are struggling out there. So I'm really concerned about that. And SSI is limited. We're limited with a smaller budget. So I just wanted to throw that out as a concern of mine.
Thank you very much. I've got your comments noted, and I think that's one of some of the things this project is trying to address. I would ask if any of our PAG members have any resources or advice for Stephen and his acquaintance in terms of resources that I might not be aware of. Maybe you can either put them in the chat now, or maybe we can follow up with Stephen or others after county staff put their heads together and share any resources that might be available. Jackie, anything to add?
Thank you.
Yes, I think we can definitely kind of check our contacts and our resources and see what we can get information for Stephen.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Jackie. Okay, anyone else with comments, public comment? Okay. So in terms of next steps, here we are still in this phase 3 develop recommendations phase that's going to go through the end of December. And before we prepare the action plan and move to our legislative adoption process. A reminder again, no PAG meeting in September. The next meeting of this group will be on October 26th at 3 p.m. I'll make sure everyone has a calendar invite. I'm not sure if we extended them through to those dates, so I'll take another look at that. We have scheduled a meeting with County Council on September 1st, but Jackie, did I see that might get moved?
That's correct. And we'll make sure everyone has that updated date. We'll send an email out to let everyone know in case they would like to join.
Great. County Planning Commission, we are meeting with on September 2nd at 5:30. Basically going to be giving a brief synopsis of what you all have discussed over the past 3 months. So that'll be a fun challenge for us to give them as much information as we can in a short period of time. And then I mentioned on September 2nd also at 2:30 that Jackie and Jenna, I don't know if Susan's going to be part of that meeting with the DEAB, Development Engineering Advisory Board. So that is another piece. So we have staff and consultant team have a lot to do in September and October. We may reach out to you to assist us, whether through email or more likely through some sort of online survey or poll as we begin to identify priorities. Maybe one more touch from you all before we reconvene in October. So keep an eye out for that. Stephen, I'll mention if you look in the chat, Victor put his email address in there and he can help you out to learn a little bit more about HUD housing. He's a great resource. So we'll also, county staff will reach out to you, but you might want to send Victor an email. And with that, if there are no further questions or comments, I want to thank everyone again for participating today. And thank you, and we'll see you in October. Have a great evening and a great rest of your summer. Thanks, everyone.